and bilingual education at the University of Florida in the United States of America in August 2019 as a Fulbright Scholar. He also completed his master's degree in gender, cultural, and literary studies at Simmons University in Boston, Massachusetts in May 2012 as a Ford Foundation International Scholar. As an active researcher, he continually serves as mentor and resource speaker of the CHED Cordillera Administrative Regions Research Publication Mentoring for faculty members of higher education institutions in the region. He also consistently serves as resource speaker in various national and international research forums. He is also a multi-awarded researcher and scholar conferred by various recognized bodies in regional and international levels. To date, he has published numerous research studies, particularly qualitative studies in index journals like International Journal of Multilingualism, Journal for Critical Education, Policy Studies, TESOL Quarterly, and Language Teaching Research, among others. His published studies cover areas of linguistically and culturally responsive teaching, teaching English learners, mother tongue-based multilingual education, qualitative practitioner inquiry or action research, and studies in the social sciences. His research works are also continually cited by other researchers in the field. Mark, it's such a pleasure to have you with us here today. Thank you once again for accepting this invitation to participate in this virtual conference. And what can I say? He's a very dear friend and scholar of mine. And well, go ahead and get us started, Mark.
Okay, thank you so much, Dion. It's really an honor to be part of this. And thank you for inviting me in this important engagement. I really would not say no to a very dear friend, you know. Dion has also been part of my, academic journey at the University of Florida. And we really had great times when we were in the United States. Thank you so much. Okay, so today I'm going to present to you a study on translanguaging. It's the title is Intersections of Teachers, Instructional and Assessment Practices, Translanguaging and Critical Pedagogy, a case study in the Northern Philippines. But before I proceed, I just want to share a disclaimer here. This presentation is based on empirical research and presents original findings and corroborated with the academic literature. The examples to substantiate the discussion were obtained from the participants' narratives, mediated by the researchers' interpretive stance. I also do not claim expertise in this topic. I draw upon my educational preparation and experiential knowledge for my discussion. Also, there is no conflict in personal interest in doing this presentation. Okay, so before I begin, allow me to introduce myself as a multilingual individual. At home, I communicate with my family with my L1, first language, which is Ilocano. And the moment I step out of the door and communicate with the community, I speak another local dialect called Bontoc, which is dominantly used and is completely different from my home language. When I go to the campus to teach, I utilize both English, a second language being used in the Philippines, and Filipino, our national language. However, when I communicate with my colleagues who come from other municipalities, I also speak in their dialect, which I am familiar with. I practice the shift from one language to another seamlessly. And in my growing years as a student, and even until now as a professional, I go through this languaging practice. English as a second language and a medium of instruction in schools has been consistently equated with progress and power. Both monolingual and multilingual speakers consider the school a nexus of English language acquisition, albeit their dispositions towards this language of power may diverge. Scholars argued that the United States education system, for instance, continually suppresses use of students' home languages in schools while placing a premium on English as the primary and main medium of instruction in the classroom. Despite significant human migration in the United States and a growing multilingual population, this practice ignores the multilingual reality in both urban and rural US classrooms. The tension between monolingual and multilingual practices and pedagogies for English learners, most recently playing out in our interpretations of the science of reading, situates students as the crossroads of linguistic justice and multilingualism and oppressive monolingual language practices. Recently, the Philippine Department of Education launched the Matatag curriculum, which will be piloted in 35 participating schools across the country by 2024. One of the highlights of the curricular revision is the omission of the mother tongue as a separate subject in the K-3 curriculum, which was persistently reported as detrimental to students' English language acquisition. However, it shall remain a medium of teaching and learning in schools. While the new K-12 curriculum is envisioned to enhance the quality of teaching and learning among Filipino students, it also continues to provide home languages or mother tongues a critical space in students' and teachers' languaging practices in school contexts. My introductory narrative solidifies the evidence that Filipino learners are multilingual by nature. Despite the widespread use of English as a medium of instruction in Philippine classrooms, learners bring their home languages to the classroom, which they use to interact with their teachers and classmates. Learners use the features of their home language freely or through a novel combination of the major languages recognized by teachers, English and Filipino, resulting in integrated discursive languaging practices. These practices, in turn, help foster learning that is owned by the language learners. Such discursive practices, when intentionally used in learning, are recognized in the academic literature as translanguaging. Our research on high school teachers' translanguaging practices in their multilingual classrooms emerged as a result of our literature review, which showed a dearth of empirical work on translanguaging in the Asian and the Philippine contexts. At the outset, we made a distinction between code switching and translanguaging in our research. We heavily relied on Ophelia Garcia's description of translanguaging as a non-hierarchical relationship between and among languages embedded within speakers' internal unitary meaning-making system, as contrasted to code switching's hierarchical orientation attributed to an external practice of treating languages independently. The terms bilingual and multilingual as used in education and educational policies has been reinvented and recreated in terms of their implications to teaching in diverse and multicultural classroom settings. In terms of the effects of bilingualism and multilingualism on students, Rivera and Mazak argued that these practices cultivate students' proficiency in two or more languages. However, these labels reinforce the notion that languages are separate entities with finite boundaries. Recently, the use of the prefix trans has aspired to blur such boundaries. While multilingualism views languages in an additive manner, or the use of multiple separate languages, translingualism refers to the synergy that treats languages as mutually influencing each other. In a similar vein, Garcia views translanguaging as a discursive practice that allows speakers to express themselves in a language that they are comfortable with through a seamless and complex network of semiotic science. Our research is theoretically framed by Max Swan's contemporary theory on the multilingual perspectives of translanguaging and Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy discourse. In a general sense, Max Swan's work problematizes the now evolving framework on translanguaging and how it has been misinterpreted and misunderstood in the context of L2 teaching and learning. While he agrees that the theory of translanguaging has made promising contributions to language policy, pedagogy, and classroom practice, he also argued that the framework has far-reaching implications that were mistakenly represented by recently conducted studies. For instance, the notion forwarded by some researchers that translanguaging perpetuates a monoglossic ideology that privileges English language dominance could undermine critical views on bilingualism and multilingualism. Max Swan thus offers an alternative view of the underlying theory of translanguaging, which he termed a multilingual perspective. His view undergirds an ingrained construct in language education that multilingualism is not only psychologically true, but also universally existent. He further contends that the more familiar languaging practices like code switching, translating, borrowing, and other processes are all forms of translanguaging. Thus, researchers and scholars should consider problematizing conventional assumptions regarding language mixing in classroom settings, where new research has contributed to our understanding of how code switching may be instrumental in teaching and learning. His theory further advances the notion that, as a pedagogical approach, translanguaging underscores the multifaceted use of multiple languages to enhance L2 learning among English learners. Following our study's goal of highlighting social justice in language education for multilingual L2 learners that spans teachers' instructional practices and translanguaging, the study was also framed by Freire's critical pedagogy discourse. This construct is also consistent with the study's theoretical structure on multilingualism as a conduit of translanguaging. The works of Freire resonate with a sense of social justice and equity. Recognizing multilingualism in L2 instruction also fosters inclusivity and dynamism, and these concepts converge at a common point where the hierarchy of language used in the classroom is disrupted. Freire's critical pedagogy puts forth the importance of dialogue and challenges the banking model of education. Freire argues that the teacher does not teach, but is in dialogue with the students. Students' actions are not limited to receiving, sorting, and storing the information deposited by the teacher. However, they can participate in the planning, teaching, and learning process by engaging in authentic learning environments. He further stresses that a classroom that puts to life critical pedagogy celebrates students' creativity, resourcefulness, and initiative despite their social and political limitations. He aptly puts it, students' creative ability is not belittled or destroyed, and their credibility enhanced. Providing a critical lens to the research, we adopted this framework. In the study, we theorized that teachers' instructional and assessment practices for English language learners in high school classrooms span learners' linguistic repertoires and nurture multilingual practices that could be viewed as translanguaging routines. These classroom practices are conceptually anchored to critical pedagogy because they disrupt the historically ingrained hierarchy of languages and their powerful impact on teaching multilingual learners. Rather, teachers' practices affirm the value of all languages spoken by the learners and use them as channels for classroom interaction, inclusive learning, and educational equity. Again, in school contexts where multilingualism is inherent to learners' identities, allowing them to access their multiple languages in learning undergirds the principles of translanguaging. To enable us to critically examine the phenomenon under study, we initially used a qualitative approach to research. However, in the process of our initial analysis, we deemed it necessary to extend the study using a quantitative approach to render a more holistic take. Following now the objectives of the study, we used an exploratory sequential mixed methods design. The rationale behind this decision lies on the complementary nature of such research method, that is, the attainment of valid and reliable findings through the integration of qualitative and quantitative data. We adopted a combination of a constructivist, positivist interpretive framework for the study. A constructivist epistemology underscores the uniqueness of the experiences that each person has. It suggests that each person's way of making sense of such experiences are valid and worthy of respect by others. This interpretive framework is aligned with the study's primary goal of describing the teachers' practices of high school teachers with English learners in real classroom settings and providing a detailed description of these practices. Meanwhile, a positivist paradigm on inquiry is usually employed by quantitative researchers who subscribe to the idea that problems could be solved through inductive or deductive scientific reasoning, observation, and measurement. The positivist scholar begins with a set of hypotheses, conducts controlled experiments that produce a statistical result, and then determines whether or not the result supports the various hypotheses. In other words, a positivist researcher heavily relies on the traditional scientific method to find answers to research problems. We used a survey questionnaire in a positivist research paradigm to describe the teacher's perceptions. In other words, we employed a mixed methods approach for two reasons. Firstly, to realize a substantial understanding of teachers' instructional and assessment practices that reflected the basic tenets of translanguaging and critical pedagogy. And secondly, to ascertain how their perceptions, quantified through a survey questionnaire, may have influenced these practices. The study's context could be understood from two divergent yet complementary perspectives. We drew upon Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. In this model, Bronfenbrenner explained that a child's inherent qualities and environment influence how he will grow and develop. He further posited that this environment comprises multiple contexts known as ecological systems that include, among others, the microsystem and the macrosystem. The first level of the study's context, the microsystem, is set in real classroom settings in 3 school districts in a northern region of the Philippines, specifically called the Cordillera Administrative Region. These classrooms, as microsystems, foster various elements that have direct contact with the child in their immediate environment, such as teachers and school peers, teacher-student relationships, physical locale, teachers' beliefs, and support from the administration. In the school's districts that we examined, the learners spoke at least 4 languages, which are characteristic of typical Philippine classrooms. This includes the learners' home languages or mother tongues, examples of which Bontoc, Kankanaey, Aplay, Ilocano, a regional lingua franca in the Cordillera region, Filipino and English, both used as popular media of instruction in the Philippines under the bilingual education policy of the country. The second level of the study's context, the meso system, is now the larger community where the schools are situated. In Bronfenbrenner's theory, the meso system covers the interactions between the child's microsystems such as the child's parents and the teachers. In the study's perspectives, the meso system fundamentally encompassed the relationship between the child's home and how such relationships impact teachers' practices for multilingual learners and families. The learners' homes played a tacit yet crucial role in the teachers' practices, which uncovered engaged attempts on home visitation for struggling multilingual learners. Thus, the learners' homes and community were given a critical space in this study because of their impact on the learning process, which yielded positive results as evident in the teachers' narratives. We purposely chose 9 teacher participants in the study's initial and qualitative stage, primarily the teachers who had more than 4 years of teaching, while we randomly selected the additional 18 participants who responded to an adopted survey questionnaire aimed at measuring their attitudes towards pedagogical translanguaging to support the data on their instructional practices obtained through qualitative approaches. We employed 3 phases of coding the data obtained from classroom observations, in-person interviews, and focus group discussions, while we also employed descriptive statistical analysis to treat the data obtained from the survey. Consequently, we converged the 2 sets of findings. Our study examined the teachers' instructional practices that demonstrated pedagogical translanguaging. We used a priori codes to synthesize our findings now into 4 things: scaffolding, collaborative teaching and learning, localization and contextualization, and connecting school and multilingual homes. I will discuss these themes in the next part of this presentation. To scaffold learning for English learners, the high school teachers allow their students to shift in between and among their multiple languages in oral and written activities like class interaction, peer or small group discussion, and relationship building activities. While the teachers allowed such discursive languaging practices, they were also mindful of their inherent role of bridging the gap between the students' home languages or other languages and the target language, which is English. In other words, when students responded to them in their home or other languages, the teachers accepted the responses. However, within the process, they guided the students and redirected them strategically until they arrived at the response in the target language. They employed either explicit correction or prompts for self-repair. One participant narrated, "I employ a strategy called elicitation. When a student articulates an opinion in response to a prompt question and uses the home language, I pause and I request the student to reformulate the response using the target language. Sometimes I also employ a clarification request technique by pretending not to understand what was uttered in the home language and request the student to re-utter and guide them through the process." Teachers' scaffolding practices were also evident on how they differentiated instruction to cater to the needs of multilingual students. One participant in the private school said, "What I do right now is I always attempt to differentiate the instruction I give to students with lower levels of English proficiency. During writing activities, I buy them time and provide more leeway by allowing them to use classroom resources like dictionary or thesaurus. I talk to them individually and provide suggestions as they work." Scaffolding practices that were also evident in the English teachers' practices noted during observations included the sustained use of graphic organizers, illustrations, and videos in dual or multiple languages. One participant, named Leo, narrated his struggles in finding instructional videos using 2 or 3 languages. However, because of the school's partnership with a state college during the pandemic, he was able to develop skills in creating his own instructional multilingual videos to cater to his students' needs. Teachers' instructional practices supported collaborative teaching and learning. In many instances of classroom observations, the teachers employed purposeful activities, cooperative learning, and peer teaching. This instructional practice was frequently used with topics that help students develop critical consciousness on social issues using language and literature. Teachers would place students into small groups and assign them facilitators. The small groups also combine both high and medium proficient students in English and ensured that each small group was represented with various languages which students spoke. In the interviews, the teachers revealed the rationale behind this instructional decision. A participant said, "When I see that students still struggle to meet the learning competencies for the lesson, I ask the other students who have already mastered the lesson to serve as tutors or collaborators for their peers. Before doing so, I first orient these tutors about the process. I realize that my students are more comfortable in asking questions with their peers than to me." Teachers' implementation of small group work, evident in classroom observations, provided the English learners spaces to use their language tools to share their experiences when prompted by questions provided by the teacher. The collaborative work also facilitated opportunities for the English learners to develop their confidence in articulating their thoughts without being constrained by English-only policies. Being allowed to access the repertoire of languages provided them the ticket to engage in low anxiety spaces that supported their learning and language acquisition. The third thematic finding on the teacher's instructional practices that demonstrated translanguaging was their sustained support for localizing and contextualizing English instruction for their learners. One distinctive instructional practice was the integration of a culture-sensitive instruction and curriculum in the prescribed framework. In the northern part of the Philippines, the Cordillera region has 8 ethno-linguistic groups who preserve and maintain their culture and traditions despite the influence of societal modernization. In this part of the country, fonts of knowledge abound. These cultural practices, systems, and beliefs are deeply ingrained within the communities, and in many instances of classroom observations, the teachers utilize these as pedagogical resources that help English learners make sense of language and content. For instance, in one classroom observation that we conducted, the teacher utilized available local literature written in English as the primary text for reading comprehension and deducing ideas from the text. The teacher gave a pre-reading activity for the class, a graphic organizer, which was primarily intended to enable the students to recall the local terms of material objects and practices used in the local literary text. In the first column of the matrix, the teacher provided the terms in English as used in the text, and in the next 3 columns, labeled Bontoc, Ilocano, Filipino, the students attempted to provide equivalent terms for the list of words. The value of the pre-reading activity lay on the disposition of the teacher to assess the students' vocabulary skills while using the English terms as frames of reference for the students to have a grasp of the text that they were about to read. In the collaborative activity that ensued, the teacher provided each group with one prompt question to discuss. The question that the small groups attempted to answer was, discuss the popular and uncommon values of people in the Cordillera region implied in the text and compare this to Filipino values that you know are related. In giving the instructions for the activity, the teacher reminded the class that the activity should be noisy, of which she meant that they have the liberty to use languages they are comfortable with and not to laugh at their classmates who express themselves in the local dialect. Another teacher participant narrated, in preparing my teaching materials, I create multiple versions in 4 local languages, the student's home language, the regional lingua franca, the national Filipino language, and the medium of instruction, which is English. These materials could cater to all of my students in the choice of language that they prefer. In capping the lesson, however, I focus more on target languages. These practices support national policies prescribed by the Filipino Department of Education, specifically the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013. Contextualization in the Philippine context is defined by the Department of Education as an educational process of relating the curriculum to a particular setting, situation, or an area of application to make the learning competencies relevant, meaningful, and useful to the learners. Meanwhile, localization as one component of contextualization in the Philippine education system refers to the process of relating content specified in the curriculum to local information and materials from the learner's community. Another important finding of the study is the connection now between the school and the multilingual learners' homes and communities facilitated by the teacher. This practice transcends the border of the school and extends to social and political dimensions of any educational context, where teachers' actions are bound by policies. Three participants during the interviews said that they reached out to the family members and the community members of struggling English learners. One teacher narrated, "For learners who are not really doing well in class, teachers visit them in their homes. Teachers will conduct the remedial at the home of the learners where parents are also present. This practice continued even after COVID-19. Those learners who are not participating in class are those who are identified as struggling learners. We really use code switching. We bring the materials with us when we visit the learners in their homes. We communicate to the parents so that they will also participate. There are really learners who are in grade 7 but still on CBC level. This is because in our community, the classroom is where they only learn or hear English. Some do not have television and internet." According to the teachers, weekly home visitations for struggling learners help them observe progress and is a common practice in Department of Education schools. This is because of the No Filipino Child Left Behind Act of 2010, which encourages local initiatives for school improvement and community-based learning. The Act also monitors compulsory school-age children. This allows flexibility in teaching to reflect community values. Teachers' assessment practices also reveal translanguaging routines in their classrooms. Evident in the teachers' practices were out of the ordinary approaches that they use to assess student learning in English. The teacher participants took a proactive stance on employing inclusive assessment practices that allowed students to access their linguistic repertoire while acquiring English. Overall, the findings revealed that the teachers assessed content comprehension and language development through role plays, drama, extemporaneous speaking, speech choir, debates, poetry readings, spoken poetry, mimes, and artistic performances using indigenous musical instruments and themes. During classroom observations and in the utilization of these assessment approaches, active student engagement was evident. One teacher participant narrated, "Majority of my students speak the local language since it is also their home language. At the start of the school year, I noticed that my students could compose poetic write-up inspired by local inspirations. At some points, the students also provided tunes to their poetic compositions. When we reach our topic on enhancing writing composition skills, I asked the students to review their compositions, and in small groups, I challenged them to translate their write-ups to English and Tagalog. After translating the pieces, I provided them the opportunity to be more creative in their presentation of their outputs in class. The deployment of performance-based assessment by the teacher participants in the study has afforded their English learners to simulate real-life communication and situations that they experience and negotiated daily in their lives. Additionally, other aspects of their being were also being nurtured. For instance, apart from the development of English learners' resourcefulness in terms of mixing various languages outputs in assessment, their creativity was also enhanced. Teachers' assessment practices, however, further revealed that they employed portfolio assessment, which were given quarterly over school year. According to the teachers, the rationale behind including portfolio assessment for students lay on their disposition to provide students equal opportunities to enhance their creativity and resourcefulness. To further ensure that this type of assessment could facilitate effective language learning acquisition among the English learners, the teachers based the content of the portfolio on the language competencies provided in the K-12 curriculum by the Philippine Department of Education. Furthermore, the teachers viewed this type of assessment as a way of helping students assess or evaluate their own performance in class and of motivating them to reflect upon how they could improve their overall performances in class. In the study, the teachers disclosed a common view, that is, while portfolio assessment was uncommon in English subjects, the students surprisingly did well in their submitted work. Again, the teachers emphasized that some of the writing production of the students, which they included in their portfolio, reflected utilization of multiple languages. Two teachers narrated, I notify my students to keep all the in-class work for compilation in the portfolio. As they gather these materials, I require them to write reflections about what they learned from the different in-class activities. They can write reflections either in Filipino or in English. Over the years, I had observed that most students design their portfolios with inspirations from local ethnic art. They use storylines that are inspired by local oral folklore in their indigenous communities. Thirdly, the study's findings reveal that teachers' assessment practices were still influenced by prescribed practices. Overall, the teachers described this situation as our hands are tied, referring to their common sentiment on standardized assessment as inevitable in the teaching practice. Our recurring quote mined from the data was summative assessments are still standards-based. Despite their doubts on the oppressive structure of standardized assessments given to students, the teachers articulated that they needed to comply but complemented such tests with additional assessment strategies. The teachers described that formal, summative assessments based on the prescribed textbooks were required for students. These assessments came in the form of unit or chapter tests, quarterly periodical exams, designed by the district and modeled after the textbook content. We also attempted to determine the perceptions of the teachers towards translanguaging by examining their attitudes towards this pedagogical strategy for English learners. To quantify their perceptions, we utilized a survey questionnaire employing a 4-point Likert scale of whether the teachers strongly agree, disagree, or strongly agree to the benchmark statements on translanguaging as a pedagogical resource. In other words, if teachers strongly agreed or agreed with the statements, their dispositions revealed a positive perception towards the indicators and therefore seemed most likely to support the use of translanguaging in their English classroom. Meanwhile, if they strongly disagreed with the indicators, they may hold a negative perception towards translanguaging and may not support its implementation in their classrooms for English learners. Overall, The study's findings revealed that the high school teachers exhibited a positive perception towards translanguaging as a pedagogical resource for knowledge construction, meaning making, problem solving, and as a resource for assessment. The respondents generally agreed with all the indicators, stating the conditions by which translanguaging serves as a resource for teaching multilingual students for second language acquisition. The overall mean of 3.44 described as agree supports this general finding. In other words, the teachers demonstrate a progressive disposition towards this emergent framework in pedagogy called translanguaging. We then converged the two sets of findings in our study. Overall, we found that the teachers' instructional practices that reflected translanguaging were buttressed by their positive perceptions towards this contemporary pedagogy in teaching English learners. To illustrate this relationship, findings converge at a certain point in terms of teachers' scaffolding practices and translanguaging as a problem-solving pedagogy. More specifically, some teachers allow their students to translanguage during oral elicitation or class interactions and give them time to reflect on their responses before uttering their words. When students respond in their home language or any other languages that they are comfortable in using, the teachers guide them through the process until they are able to communicate in the target language. This is supported by a positive attitude towards translanguaging as a resource for problem solving, specifically in indicator C.6, or teaching students in their multiple languages in English class allows them to organize their thoughts in their languages before articulating them in English. The teachers agreed with this indicator, which obtained a mean of 3.53. Teachers' instructional practices on contextualization that reflect translanguaging were also evident from the findings. By allowing English language learners to use their multiple languages in class via translanguaging, teachers could help learners establish connections to make content and language more meaningful. Evident from the teachers' narratives were episodes of utilizing localized materials and situating language learning in the learner's local context. These practices seemed nurtured by the teacher's positive attitudes towards conditions of translanguaging in the survey. For instance, the indicators, teaching students in their multiple languages helps in providing context, which in turn helps them relate to the lesson. And teaching students in their multiple languages facilitates their ability to relate their experiences and previous knowledge to new concepts in class, were considered translanguaging practices by the teachers. These indicators obtained a mean of 3.56 and 3.69 respectively, and in relation to the means of the other indicators, these numbers are relatively high, which further implies that the respondents agreed on them with conviction. And in the process of doing this, the students are also able to bridge the gap between their home language and English language learning. Based on the experiences and the narratives of the teachers, three important themes emerged from this. They have cross-language transfer, identity affirmation, and learning and cultural appropriation. In other words, the teachers' translanguaging practices have afforded the students to undergo through these important processes, particularly in affirming their multilingual identities as learners and in nurturing their cultural consciousness in the classroom. So in terms of the findings of the study, the study's findings warrant a critical examination of translanguaging, both as a theoretical framework and as culturally, linguistically responsive pedagogy for high school multilingual learners. The teacher's instructional and assessment practices indicate far-reaching implications for educational research and English language teaching. In terms of educational research, the study's findings affirm what the academic literature underscores about the benefits of providing multilingualism as a vital space in teaching English learners who are simultaneous multilinguals. The findings further embrace what other scholars emphasize about translanguaging as a discursive language practice that enhances L2 learning while enriching the learner's home language proficiency. This empirical research studies findings also put into the fore of this course an enriched research methodology in analyzing translanguaging practices in classroom settings. Okay, I think the presentation is done. Thank you very much for your engagement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mark Preston. Thank you very much. Please, everyone who's here with us today, both in the Zoom session and also this is being recorded and transmitted via Facebook. So thank you very much. And please join me in providing a warm applause for Mark. It's a very amazing study. I know with a lot of findings, some very hot and trendy topics nowadays in language education all over the world. So I know that there are probably several questions that people might have or comments. If you would please, we're going to now open the space for comments and questions. If you could go raising your hands, or also if you have problems with your audio, then you can also please share your questions in the chat box and I will gladly read them on here. So we'll give a couple of seconds in case I see that somebody raises their hands or comments. Okay, so Graciela Arismendi says, thank you so much for the presentation. Could you clarify for me a little bit? Bilingual, 2 languages spoken, multilingual, 2 or more languages spoken, translanguaging, 2 or more languages spoken. Could we say that translanguaging is then a type of code switching which involves any of the languages spoken by an individual while in communication with others in either a formal or informal context? So the 3 concepts cited above are more related to the number of languages spoken, but the main difference among them lies on the possession of languages we use, 1 and 2 or more, and translanguaging more related to the switch we have when using the 2 or more languages in a situation. There's also, I think you can check them in the chat box too, Mark, if you need to go back and revise them, but there's a second question here. Is translanguaging a phenomena occurring in writing too? And again, thank you for your presentation.
Okay, I think that's really a very good question. So in our study, we really had to distinguish between code switching and translanguaging. For this are 2 different constructs. And as I have said, we really heavily relied on Ofelia Gracia's concept of translanguaging, which actually is more of an internal process. Everyone, many people would say they are multilingual, they are bilingual, but in terms of using the language internally, it's more related to translanguaging because once a speaker uses a certain language within the internal part of the thinking, it's more of translanguaging because code switching relies more on an external process. Okay, the 2 languages that speakers would possess are treated independently. Also for example, in the United States, when we say code switching, you know that English is the more dominant language, and then you code switch to Spanish. But when we talk of translanguaging, there is more of that internal process of engaging in your linguistic repertoire as a unitary meaning-making process. And in terms of the question of translanguaging occurring also in writing, well, as far as the Philippine students are concerned, translanguaging also happens in the writing process because based on our study, we look at teachers of how they would also allow the students to access their linguistic repertoire in the writing outputs that they had for class. So in other words, the students would access the different languages that they know, and they would produce them in one writing output that they would submit or serve as their outputs in their classes, in the classrooms that we observed.
Thank you so much, Mark. So we have a few more questions here, and of course, congratulations. It says, thank you for your talk. It's a wonderful research. Thank you. Yerim says, I would like to know, what do you think was the beneficial tool or factor that helped teachers to have a positive attitude towards translanguaging?
Okay. I really have to admit that in the Philippine context, translanguaging is not yet that accepted. No, most teachers do not yet embrace this framework because perhaps one of the reasons they are not much exposed to this theoretical framework on translanguaging. However, one of the important benefits that we saw based on the study is that I think it opened more their thinking towards being more accepting of the students' use of their home languages or the other languages that they use. Before I went to Florida, to do my PhD studies, we really had teachers who are really close to, the English only policy in the classrooms. This is an English only classroom. This is an English only policy that I have in my classroom. And, these certain languages are not quite accepted. In other words, when I ask questions in English, you have to answer to me in English. That is the mindset of many teachers. But perhaps in the research that we have done, we have realized that they are now more open, to embracing multilingualism in the classrooms, considering also the fact that perhaps at some point they were exposed, to certain seminars or workshops which have opened their minds towards multilingualism and translanguaging practices in general.
Thank you so much, Mark. So we have another question here. What is the status of English given by the Philippine education system when interacting with the 4 local languages? This is from Salvador.
Yes. Okay. So recently, the Philippine Department of Education has really reverted to the bilingual education policy, which is English and Filipino. So, for example, subjects like science, math, what else? Literature are taught in English, while few other subjects are taught in Filipino. So there is not really attention, but there is some sort of interaction between these 2 languages, English and Filipino. But as far as the curriculum is concerned, the use of mother tongues or home languages has not been, it was like the priority is still on English and Filipino. The fact that they removed mother tongue as a separate course in the curriculum is an implication that the Philippine educational system is really bent more towards using English and Filipino as the medium of instruction. Well, but generally, English is very dominant in the Philippine educational system.
Thank you very much, Mark, for all these insightful, enlightening answers. We have lots of comments about thank you very much. Thank you very much. Wonderful information. Thank you for sharing. Some people are interested also in sharing this information with their students as well. So if you have either a web page or a Google Scholar or something that you could share with us afterwards in the chat box, we would really appreciate that so that we can follow you and learn more about the research studies that you are conducting as well. And let me see, I don't see any hands, but I do have another question. So you touched upon critical thinking, right? And you know that that's right up my alley. I really enjoy critical thinking, so I have to ask about this. So sometimes in the experience that I've had in conducting research in terms of high order thinking skills, critical thinking being one form of high order thinking, sometimes we've seen a resistance or a belief that teachers have that language can be a barrier to be able to develop critical thinking skills, among other high order thinking skills as well. So I wanted to see like what your experience was in this study and how, if this was a barrier that teachers believed or found, how did they overcome it to really engage in these critical thinking skills?
Yeah, thank you, Dion, for the question. I think based also on the classroom observations that we conducted with these high school teachers, and based also on how we observe the students, I think in the classrooms, when students spoke in languages that they were comfortable with, like for example their home language or Ilocano, which is the regional lingua franca in most school districts in the context that we examine, students were more critical in the sense that they were able to articulate more how they felt, how they thought about the situation versus using really English that has delimited their capacity to articulate their thoughts. No? So in other words, the teachers were really more welcoming in terms of how they allow their students to speak in either the home language or the lingua franca to enable them to articulate a critical reflection about lessons in class, about questions that they pose. No, but one thing for sure is that despite allowing their students to really use these languages, they have redirected them towards the target language, which is English, because one of the teachers said, if we allow these students to speak much in their home language, we might be able to compromise their capacity to improve their grammatical skills in English or in the target language, But still, despite this, we allow them to use these languages because we want them to really articulate or talk about their thoughts without being constrained by the use of English, which delimits their ability to speak.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. And I think it's something that also happens and that we've seen in context between using English and Spanish, for example, right, is that when we force students to try, when we're in our language classes, when we force students to try to perform and use critical thinking in English as the second or foreign language, then sometimes it becomes more challenging. It's another added cognitive load on there, right? So we have to kind of sometimes facilitate, depending on the language level, we can allow them to use translanguaging to go back and forth. And of course, be able to engage in these more demanding tasks, right? And remember the language expectations that we have as well.
Yes.
So we have a couple more questions here in the chat box. First one is if you could provide some highly recommended references. Of course, besides your own. No, I'm joking. What would be some people that you would recommend for people to start familiarizing themselves a little bit more with translanguaging and with all these other important aspects that you've talked about? And a second one is it's more of an individual question, disclaimer. What would be your perspective towards the named languages perspective?
Okay, so in terms of the references, okay, I might be able to share them to you, Dion. Maybe after this conversation.
Of course, and I'll pass them on.
In terms of the more personal question, named languages. That's really a very interesting question. Well, I've watched a lot of Ophelia Garcia's videos on translanguaging, and she also kept talking about this named languages prescribed by nation states. For example, in the United States of America. But on a personal note, I think that named languages may still have a space, in translanguaging pedagogy, for example, in multilingual classrooms. But I think when it comes to the framework of translanguaging, we should not be relying too much on named languages. In other words, it's a seamless use of languages. There is no hierarchy in terms of these named languages, because as far as the Philippine setting is concerned, really, English is one of these languages that people attribute to in terms of success, intelligence. In the capital city of Manila, if you speak English, people will think that you are the best. You are an educated person. But in rural multilingual spaces, you know, I think we should not give too much attention on having these name languages as barriers to allowing our students to use translanguaging in the classroom, of course, including those of teachers.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mark. So I have one more question. We still have a few more minutes, so I put a final call in the chat box. If there are any final questions, this is your time before we thank Mark for his presentation today. So you touched upon teachers' perspectives and teachers' instructional practices, right? So that was part of your study to see how they correlated or not. So in this sense, going back to your comment about that translanguaging, for example, was a topic or maybe that not everybody was very familiar with, right? So how did that difference kind of play into the difference that there could have been between perspectives and the actual implementation of the practices? Because we commonly see a difference between what teachers believe should happen and what's actually happening in the classroom. So if you add on another layer that there might be a lack of firm knowledge basis regarding the construct per se, and I know that because I see that also in high order thinking skills, then what happens there?
Yeah, we were really surprised with the result of the quantitative part of our study in terms of their perspectives or attitudes towards translanguaging. Perhaps it was more of some sort of like, okay, I am familiar with this indicator, I am familiar with this practice. Okay, I'd rather agree with it, rather than having to disagree with this statement. So in terms of critical thinking, one of the recommendations that we had in the study is, a series of more capacity building activities for teachers to develop a more critical perspective towards translanguaging. As I have said, these teachers are not much exposed yet to translanguaging as a framework, both in teaching and research. And so we were really surprised at how the results turned out. So maybe one gap in our study is we wanted to we wanted to compare now the perceptions of the teachers so that we would be able to have a more holistic answer to their perspectives. Because for this study, we just use descriptive statistics of mean and, just trying to look at the level of agreement to the benchmark statements that we use. But perhaps we wanted to extend more towards developing a hypothesis in terms of how their perspectives vary as far as their experiences are concerned, as far as their educational experiences are concerned, or even the number of years that they have been teaching in classrooms.
Thank you so much. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and have to close here because we're coming to an end of this amazing presentation. Mark, thank you very much on behalf of the organizing committee for the second International Virtual Conference on Teacher Training, which focused on research on language teaching and learning in a post-pandemic era. I would really like to thank you once again for accepting this invitation, to participate as a plenary speaker. And thank you very much. We will be in touch and we will be sending you your certificate of participation as well by email. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to those who are connected via Facebook, and please do not leave the session as we will have more conferences scheduled for today. So thank you once again, and a big applause for Mark. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's already 12 12:09 in the morning here, so I'll have to sign off. Thank you so much,
You have to
Dion, for
get to
this
bed.
opportunity, and I hope to see you again next time.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
Have a
all.
wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.